The alien fleet appeared on our sensors at 0312 hours, and nobody screamed. That surprised me. I had been stationed on Orbital Defense Platform 7 for 11 months, and in all the drills we had run, someone always screamed, a junior technician, a new recruit, somebody with a family photo taped to their console. Someone always made a sound that did not belong in a military setting. But when the Vethkara Armada dropped out of transit space on that cold Tuesday morning, the bridge went so quiet that I could hear the soft breathing of the dog sleeping across my boots. His name was Sergeant Bricks. He weighed 91 kilograms, and he was the best friend I had ever had in my life. I looked at the sensor display and felt my mouth go dry. There were thousands of them. Not hundreds, thousands. The display kept refreshing, kept trying to count them, and the number climbed like a fever. 3,400 warships arranged in a formation so precise it looked like something drawn with a ruler. The Vethkara did not move through space the way we did, with hesitation and careful calculation. They moved like a fist. They arrived like a verdict. My name is Owen Graves, and I was 34 years old when the most powerful alien armada in the known galaxy came to end the human race. I remember exactly what I was doing when the alarm sounded. I was reading a letter from my younger sister, Clara, who lived in a small town in Wales and kept bees, and never seemed to worry about anything. She had written to me about a new hive she was building, about the way the morning light looked over the hills near her house, about the honey she was saving for me when I came home. I had read the letter 3 times already that week. I kept it in my left breast pocket, folded into quarters, because I liked the weight of it there. When the proximity alarm went off, I pressed my hand flat against my chest for just a second, feeling the shape of Clara's letter through the fabric of my uniform. Then I stood up. Bricks was on his feet before I was. That was always how it worked with him. I do not know if he heard something in my body before I did. Some shift in breathing or heartbeat that told him the world had changed. What I know is that he was standing with his ears forward, and his golden eyes already on the door, before the alarm had even finished its first cycle. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Easy," I said. He did not relax, but he waited. The bridge of Platform 7 was not a large space. It held 22 people when fully staffed. A curved row of consoles facing a main display screen that covered the entire forward wall. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Holt was already at the center console when I arrived. Her gray hair pulled back sharply, her hands moving across the display with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this moment. "Graves," she said without looking up. "Get your handler team to the lower deck. Wake them all up." "Yes, ma'am." I paused. "How many?" She looked up then, and I saw something in her face that I had never seen there before. It was not fear exactly. It was something more like awe. The kind of awe you feel when something is so much larger than anything you imagined, that your mind needs a moment to accept it as real. "All of them," she said. "Every last one." I took the stairs down 2 at a time, Bricks moving silently at my heel. The lower deck of Platform 7 smelled like dog and engine grease, and the faint chemical tang of the nutrient packs we fed the hounds each morning. To some people that smell was unpleasant. To me it was the smell of safety. It was the smell of something that had my back. There were 42 handlers sleeping in that lower deck when I came through the door. There were 42 dogs sleeping beside them. By the time I had reached the 5th bunk and started shaking shoulders, the dogs were already awake, already on their feet, already watching the door with the focused attention that only a trained animal can hold. They did not bark, they did not make noise. They stood and they waited, and their eyes caught the low emergency lighting, and turned it into something that looked almost like fire. I had been working with the Hound Corps for 6 years. I still felt it in my chest sometimes, that sight. 42 enormous, engineered animals standing perfectly still in the dark, waiting for a command. Nobody in the galaxy knew we had them. That was the plan. Corporal Danny Firth was the last one awake. He was 22 years old and slept like a stone, which was something his hound, a dark brindle female named Petra, had apparently accepted as a personal failing. She had his sleeve in her mouth and was pulling steadily when I reached his bunk. "Up, Danny," I said. He sat up, hair sideways, eyes still mostly closed. Then he looked at Petra, who dropped his sleeve and stared at him with an expression that communicated, as clearly as any human face could, that something serious was happening. Danny was awake in under 3 seconds. "How bad?" he asked. I thought about lying. I thought about softening it, about saying something that would give him time to adjust. Then I decided he deserved the truth, because he was going to find out in about 4 minutes anyway, and I respected him too much to waste those 4 minutes. "The worst," I said. "Get your gear." We moved back up to the observation level as a group, 42 handlers and 42 hounds filling the corridor in near-perfect silence. The sound of all those paws on the metal floor was something between a whisper and a drumbeat. I have never found the right word for it. It was the sound of something very large that was also very patient, and it made the air feel different somehow, heavier and more purposeful. When we reached the observation window, I heard several of the newer handlers draw breath sharply. The alien fleet filled the sky, even through the scratched polymer of the observation window, even reduced to the size of what the naked eye could resolve at that distance. The Vethkara Armada was an overwhelming thing to look at. The ships caught the light of the sun differently than our ships did, their hulls a dark material that seemed to pull light inward rather than reflect it. They moved with absolute coordination, thousands of vessels adjusting position together like a single organism, like something that thought with one mind and acted with one body. They had never lost. That was the fact that sat in the back of every human mind that morning. The Vethkara expansion had been moving through our arm of the galaxy for 41 years. In that time, they had encountered 14 spacefaring civilizations, 14 species who had looked up at the stars and built ships, and reached outward with the particular kind of hope that only a living thing can feel. 12 of those civilizations were gone. 2 had surrendered and been absorbed, their identities and cultures dissolved into the Vethkara administrative structure like sugar in hot water. The Vethkara did not hate the species they conquered. They simply did not consider resistance to be a realistic option, and in 41 years of expansion, nothing had proven them wrong. Nothing yet. At 03:49 hours, a transmission came through on the universal frequency. The translation software gave us the voice in a flat, almost bored tone, which I later learned was accurate to the original. The Vethkara commander did not consider this announcement important enough to inflect with emotion. Biological designation: human. Your system is encircled. Your defensive installations are within range of primary engagement systems. Surrender of all military assets and transfer of governmental authority to Vethkara Administrative Command is required within 2 of your rotational periods. Non-compliance will result in the removal of your species from this system. This transmission will not be repeated. The bridge was silent for a moment after the translation finished. Then Lieutenant Commander Holt reached forward and pressed the comm button. "This is Lieutenant Commander Patricia Holt of the Earth Defense Force, Platform 7. Message received." She paused, and I saw the corner of her mouth move. "Please stand by." She released the button, and then she laughed. It was not a loud laugh, or a long one. It was the short, quiet laugh of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something, and has finally seen it arrive exactly as expected. She turned from the console and looked at me, and her eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. "Graves," she said, "signal the core." I put my hand on Brix's back. He was warm under my palm, solid and steady, and he leaned into my hand just slightly the way he always did. That small and wordless communication that meant, "I am here. I am ready. I am with you." "Yes, ma'am," I said. I did not feel afraid. I felt something much older than fear. Something that had no clean name in English, or in any language I knew. It lived somewhere between pride and grief and love, and it belonged entirely to the moment when you stand beside something that trusts you completely, and you realize that you will do anything, anything at all, to be worth that trust. Outside the observation window, the Vethkara fleet held its perfect, patient formation. They were waiting for us to break. They did not know what we had built. They did not know what we had spent 60 years preparing, what we had hidden in the lower decks and the deep installations and the quiet facilities on moons and asteroids where their long-range scouts had never thought to look. They did not know about the kennels. They did not know about the bond. They did not know that the species they had just given 2 rotational periods to surrender was the same species that had looked at a large and dangerous predator 10,000 years ago and decided, with the particular stubbornness that defines us above all other traits, to make it part of the family. Brix pressed his nose against the back of my hand. I scratched him behind the ear. "Good boy," I said quietly. "We're going to show them something new." He wagged his tail once, slow and certain. Outside, the stars were still. Not for long. No other species in the galaxy had ever done what we did with dogs. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds small, almost embarrassing, when you say it plainly. Of all the things humanity might be remembered for, of all the achievements we could point to, the one that saved us was a relationship we had started before we had written language, before we had metal tools, before we had anything except fire and fear, and the cold of the open wilderness pressing in from every direction. We had looked at wolves and we had seen something we recognized. Not intelligence exactly, not the calculating kind, something else, loyalty, a willingness to choose a side and hold to it. We had 10,000 years of practice turning that choice into something extraordinary. The Hound Corps did not begin as a military program. That is important to understand. It began as a question, asked by a biologist named Dr. Caroline Ford at a defense research facility in Scotland, sometime in the early part of the century, when the first confirmed signals from Vethkara expansion activity were still being debated in academic circles, and most governments were not yet willing to call it what it was. Dr. Ford's question was simple. She asked, if we are going to face an enemy that is larger, faster, and technologically superior to us in almost every measurable way, what asymmetric advantage does humanity have that no other species could replicate? The committee she was presenting to expected her to say something about human creativity, or adaptability, or the particular chaos of our decision-making under pressure, all things that had been discussed many times before. Instead, she pulled up a photograph of a German Shepherd working dog mid-leap during an obstacle course trial, and she said, "This." It took her 4 years to get funding. It took another 8 years before the first generation of enhanced animals came out of the program, and by that point Dr. Ford had assembled a team of geneticists, veterinary surgeons, behavioral scientists, and military strategists who had quietly become the most tightly kept secret in human history. The program was called, in its official documents, the Advanced Canine Tactical Initiative. Every person who worked on it signed agreements that carried penalties serious enough that nobody ever broke them. In 40 years of operation, not a single detail leaked to the public, and certainly not to Vethkara intelligence, which we knew by then was monitoring our communications. We called them the Hound Corps among ourselves. The enhancements were layered and incremental, built over multiple generations of animals, always with the welfare of the dogs as a primary concern. Dr. Ford had been very specific about that in her original proposal. She had written, "We are not building weapons. We are partnering with them. The distinction matters, and if we forget it, we will lose everything that makes this possible." The first layer was physical. Selective breeding and careful genetic adjustment over multiple generations produced animals that were larger, denser, and faster than any natural dog had ever been. Not grotesquely so, not in a way that looked engineered to an uninformed eye. Brix, at 91 kilograms, was built like something between a large wolf and a small bear, but he moved with the fluid ease of an animal whose body had been designed to move that way, and his face still had the expressiveness, the warmth, the particular quality of readability that dogs had been refining for 10 millennia of living beside humans. He still had the eyes that could break your heart. The second layer was sensory. Vethkara ships were built around electronic systems that human targeting technology struggled to track in close-range environments. Their interior architecture was designed to confuse human spatial reasoning, with corridors that curved in ways that interfered with our sense of direction, and lighting spectrums that our eyes processed poorly. The enhanced hounds had no such weakness. Their olfactory systems could map the interior of a Vethkara vessel faster than any scanner we had built. Their hearing operated across a range that picked up the electromagnetic interference patterns the alien ships produced, which translated, for a trained hound, into something like a map. They could navigate a Vethkara warship in complete darkness, in zero gravity, under active combat conditions, faster and more accurately than any human soldier. The third layer was the one that had taken longest to develop, and that I thought about most, because it was the one that lived closest to what I would call the soul of the program. It was the neural interface. Not a device implanted in the dog, nothing that overrode their will or reduced them to a remote-controlled system. What Dr. Ford's team eventually produced, after nearly 2 decades of careful work, was a bond amplifier, a thin mesh of biocompatible material, woven into a lightweight vest that each hound wore, paired with a corresponding receiver, worn by the human handler. It did not allow the handler to control the dog. It allowed them to share perception. When Brix was running, I could feel the shape of the corridor he was moving through. When he scented something, I received a translated signal that my brain processed as a kind of colored impression, a wash of information that I could not have put into words but that told me, clearly, what he had found and where. When he was calm, I felt it. When something alarmed him, I knew before he moved. And the reverse was also true. He knew my intention, not my words, not my commands, but the direction of my focus, the shape of my urgency. When I needed him to go left, the thought of left moved through the connection and he was already turning. When I was in danger, he knew it the way he would have known it from scent and sound in a natural setting, but faster, and without the ambiguity of distance between us. The trainers called it the sync. We called it something we did not need to name. On the morning the Vethkara fleet arrived, the Hound Corps had 430,000 active animals distributed across every human installation in the Solar Defense Network. Each one was bonded to a handler. Each handler had trained for an average of 6 years to work with their specific dog, because the bond was not transferable. It was not a skill. It was a relationship, and relationships are built over time, and they are built out of 10,000 small moments that do not look important until suddenly they are the only thing that matters. Danny Firth had been with Petra for 4 years. She had been with him through 2 deployments and a knee surgery, and the night he received word that his father had passed away at home in Edinburgh. I had seen Petra lay her head on Danny's knee that night, and hold it there for 2 hours without moving, without asking for anything, just offering the solid and uncomplicated weight of herself, and I had seen Danny's hand rest on her head, and some of the sharp edge go out of his face. I had been with Brix for 6 years. I will not try to describe it completely. I do not think language has the right tools. What I will say is that there is a specific quality of trust that builds between a person and a dog over years of shared difficulty, and it is different from the trust between humans, not better or worse, but different in the way it sits in the body. Human trust is built on understanding, on communication, on the slow accumulation of evidence that another person's mind works in ways compatible with your own. The trust between a handler and a hound is built on something more immediate. It is built on presence, on the simple, repeated fact of showing up for each other in the small ways, day after day, until the showing up becomes something automatic, something that no longer requires decision. Brix had never once, in 6 years, been anywhere except exactly where I needed him. I had spent 6 years trying to deserve that. At 4:12 hours, the signal went out to every installation in the network. It was a single code word, chosen by a committee so many years ago that most of the people who had chosen it were long retired or no longer living. The word was release. It went out on a frequency the Vethkara had never thought to monitor, because it was too low bandwidth to carry the kind of strategic communication they were looking for. They were watching for large data transmissions, encrypted command structures, the complex back and forth of a military organization trying to coordinate a response. They were not watching for a single word. They did not know what that word meant. In the lower deck of Platform 7, I heard it come through my earpiece at a murmur, barely louder than my own breathing. Release. I looked at Brix. He was already looking at me. In the 42 handler bays of Platform 7's lower deck, and in the hundreds of installations across the defense network, and in the deep stations on the dark side of moons, and in the armored chambers of asteroid bases that had been built for exactly this moment, every handler heard the same word at the same moment. And every dog felt, through the bond, the shift in their handler's body, the change in breathing, the change in weight, the particular quality of readiness that is different from ordinary alertness, the way a coiled spring is different from a loose wire. Every dog stood up straighter. Every tail went still. The breach pods were single-occupancy tubes, shaped roughly like a thick dart, built from a ceramic composite that absorbed most scanner frequencies and reflected very little. They were designed to be fired from the installation's secondary launch bays, the ones that didn't appear on the main sensor display, the ones that had been built into the structure years ago under the listed purpose of equipment resupply. Each pod carried one hound and one handler. They traveled fast and they were nearly invisible to the scanning technology the Vethkara used, because they had been designed specifically against Vethkara scanning technology, reverse-engineered from transmissions the intelligence teams had been collecting for decades. When they hit the hull of an enemy ship, a shaped charge opened a breach. The dog went first. That was always the doctrine. The dog goes first. Not because the dog was expendable. Dr. Ford had been extremely clear about this in the original program documents, and every trainer after her had repeated it. The dog goes first because the dog is better at what the first moments of a breach require. Better senses, better speed, better spatial awareness in an unknown environment. The handler follows and supports and makes the larger decisions. The hound clears the immediate space and finds the path. It works because they trust each other completely. At 04:19 hours, I climbed into my breach pod with Bricks pressed against my leg, his warm solidity filling the left side of the tube. The pod was tight enough that we were in physical contact the whole time, which was intentional. Physical contact deepened the sync. I could feel his heartbeat through the vest, steady and strong, a rhythm that was somehow calming, even though everything else was the opposite of calm. The pod sealed. The darkness inside was complete. "You ready?" I asked him, because I always asked him, even though I already knew the answer. He pressed his nose against my jaw. Warm breath, brief and certain. I put my hand on his back and held it there. The launch mechanism engaged, and the war began. The pod hit the hull of the Vethkara cruiser with a sound like the world ending. For approximately 3 seconds, which felt like much longer, everything was impact and noise and the kind of physical chaos that compresses time strangely, where each fraction of a second seems to contain too much sensation for the brain to process in order. The shaped charge fired. The hull opened. Cold alien atmosphere rushed in to equalize. Then Bricks was through the breach, and I was right behind him. The interior of the Vethkara cruiser was not like anything I had trained for, and I had trained for a great deal. The corridors were wide by our standards but curved in ways that made depth perception unreliable, bending slightly in 3 dimensions simultaneously, so that what looked like a straight path was actually a slow spiral. The lighting was a deep violet-gray spectrum that my eyes struggled to read clearly. The surfaces were smooth and slightly warm to the touch, which I discovered when I put my hand on the wall to orient myself and found the temperature unexpectedly close to body heat. Bricks was 10 meters ahead of me before I had finished standing upright. Through the sync, I felt the shape of the corridor ahead. Not visually, not the way I would have described seeing it, but as a kind of spatial certainty that existed somewhere below conscious thought. I knew the corridor turned left 12 meters ahead. I knew there was a cross passage 8 meters beyond that. I knew there were 3 heat signatures approaching from the left turn, moving fast. I raised my weapon. Bricks was already moving perpendicular to the corridor, using the curved wall to gain height, his enhanced claws finding purchase on the smooth Vethkara surface in a way that should not have been possible, and was possible anyway, because of the micro-texture engineered into his pads. He went up the wall, across the ceiling, and came down on the far side of the approaching Vethkara soldiers before they had finished processing what they were looking at. The Vethkara were not small creatures. They stood between 2 and 2.5 meters tall, with a bilateral symmetry that was similar enough to ours to be disorienting, but their reaction speed and physical strength exceeded ours considerably. They had been the dominant combatants in every engagement of their 41-year expansion. They had never encountered a species that could match them in direct physical confrontation. They had not prepared for something that did not need to match them. Bricks was not fighting them the way a human would fight them. He was not standing his ground or exchanging the kind of measured, positional engagement that their training had prepared them for. He was a 91-kilogram animal, moving at speeds their targeting systems had not been designed to track, using the 3-dimensional geometry of their own corridors against them. changing direction mid-motion with the fluid ease of something that had no expectation of moving in a straight line. Through the sync I felt his focus like a clean, bright point of clarity. No fear, no hesitation, just the problem in front of him, and the solution his body already knew. I moved up through the corridor as the engagement concluded, and I felt through the connection the moment Brix finished, and turned back toward me, his attention shifting to the next corridor section, already scanning. "Good," I said quietly, reaching him. He glanced at me once, acknowledging, and moved on. We were not the only breach, not by a significant margin. My earpiece was alive with fragments of communication from the other handler teams across the ship, and beyond this ship the comms traffic from the broader engagement was a rising sound like distant weather. I caught pieces of it as we moved. Pod teams Charlie and Delta had reached the engineering section. Pod team Foxtrot reported that the Vethkara crew on their level was falling back and sealing corridors, which was exactly the response we had trained against. Pod team Bravo's handler, a woman named Lucy Carr, reported in a voice that was completely calm that her hound Kodak had found the secondary navigation array and was holding position. The Vethkara had not designed their ships to be defended from the inside. Why would they? They had never needed to. Their ships had never been successfully breached. Their doctrine was built around exterior combat, around the enormous and overwhelming firepower of their fleet, the kind of tactical certainty that comes from never losing. They had no plan for what to do when the corridors of their own vessels were suddenly full of something they could not target effectively, something that moved in ways their threat response training had not catalogued, something that did not slow down when injured the way they expected a creature to slow down, because the bond amplified not just perception, but the particular quality of determined calm that a well-trained hound carries into any situation. Danny Firth's voice came through my earpiece from 2 decks above me. "Graves, this is Firth. Petra's found the command communications hub. We're at the door, waiting for your signal." I was moving through the 4th corridor section from our breach point, Brix reading the path ahead through scent and sound, and the electromagnetic map his enhanced senses built automatically from the ship's own systems. "Hold position, Danny," I said. 2 minutes. Holding. The command communications hub was the target. Not the weapons systems, not the engines, the communications. If we could isolate this ship's ability to coordinate with the rest of the fleet, if we could do the same thing simultaneously on enough vessels, the Vethkara Armada would develop a coordination problem that their command structure was not flexible enough to solve quickly. Their strength was in their precision, their perfect synchronization. Break the synchronization, and you change the nature of the fight entirely. This was the plan. It had been the plan for a long time. Brix stopped. Through the sync I felt it before I understood it. A specific quality of alertness that was different from his combat focus. This was something else. A scent he was processing. Something that registered in the translated information I received as a spike of concern. I stopped too. "What is it?" I murmured. He turned his head slightly, orienting on something beyond the wall to our right. Through the connection, I felt the directional information as a kind of pull, like a compass needle. Whatever he had found was on the other side of that wall and moving toward us. I held very still. The wall section to our right opened. A maintenance access panel, sliding sideways, revealing a passage I had not known was there because it did not appear on our pre-mission structural maps of the ship. The Vethkara that stepped through it was not a soldier. It was wearing what I recognized, from our intelligence briefings, as a technical specialist's designation markings. It was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Brix was between us before either of us had processed the situation. He did not escalate. That was also part of the training. A technical specialist presented a different category of situation than an armed soldier, and Brix understood categories in a way that still amazed me after 6 years. He simply placed himself in the space between me and the Vethkara technical specialist, very large and very still, and looked at the alien with an expression that communicated the situation with complete clarity. The technical specialist did not move. I stepped forward, gestured with my hand signal for detain, and Brix maintained position while I secured the specialist. Neither of us hurt them. That was important to me on a level I could not have fully explained in the middle of a combat operation, but that lived in me clearly nonetheless. "Danny," I said into the comm, Move on the communications hub, now. Moving, Danny said. From above me I heard, faint through 3 decks of alien hull material, the sound of Petra beginning to work. We pushed to the command communications hub on level 2, Bricks leading, the 2 of us moving through corridors that were becoming increasingly empty, as the Vethkara crew fell back toward what they had designated as defensible positions. This was a pattern I recognized from our planning sessions. The alien military doctrine called for consolidation under breach conditions, concentrating forces at key structural points, and attempting to contain the breach zone while the ship's weapons systems addressed the threat externally. The problem with that doctrine, in this specific situation, was that there was no external threat to address. The breach pods had already fired, the hounds were already inside, and the Vethkara ships had been designed with their interior defense as an afterthought, because it had never been necessary before. We reached the communications hub at 0447 hours, 28 minutes after breaching the hull. Danny was already there with Petra, along with 2 other handler pairs from our pod cluster. The hub door was sealed, a heavy circular barrier of the same dark material as the ship's hull, which meant it would resist the tools we carried for a while. Petra had already solved this. She was sitting beside a wall panel she had opened with her enhanced forelimb dexterity, her head tilted at the angle she always used when she was processing something through her augmented senses. Danny was crouched beside her, one hand resting lightly on her back, the sink between them visible in the way they both oriented, at exactly the same moment, toward the same section of the panel. She found the manual release pathway, Danny said, not looking up. Inside the environmental systems. 30 seconds. I looked at Danny. He was 22 years old, and he was the most gifted handler I had worked with in 6 years of service. He spoke about Petra the way you might speak about a colleague whose expertise you deeply respected, with a kind of matter-of-fact confidence that was nothing like boasting because it was entirely about her and not about himself. 30 seconds later, the hub door opened. We went in. The communications array of a Vethkara cruiser was not a simple system. It was a layered architecture, redundant in ways that reflected a species that had learned from the communications failures of the civilizations they had consumed. It was designed to keep transmitting under almost any condition. Bricks found the primary conduit by scent. I have explained this to non-handlers many times and never quite managed to make it fully comprehensible, so I will simply say that the enhanced olfactory system of a hound core animal can distinguish the electromagnetic output signature of active hardware components from inactive ones, and that in a complex system, this gives them the ability to navigate directly to what is operating and what is load-bearing in ways that save enormous amounts of time. He sat down in front of the correct panel and looked at me. "Good boy," I said. I began to work. 2 decks below us, through the floor plates and the alien architecture, and the distant sound of the engagement still moving through the other corridors of the ship, I could feel something changing in the quality of the larger situation. It was not information I could point to clearly. It was a handler's sense of the battle's direction, built from everything I was hearing in my earpiece, and feeling through the sync, and reading in the micro-expressions of the dogs around me, because the dogs always knew before we did. Every dog in that room was calmer than they had been 20 minutes ago. That was meaningful. I finished isolating the primary conduit and moved to the secondary. Danny worked beside me on the tertiary pathways. The other 2 handler pairs held the door. At 0501 hours, Platform 7's comms officer came through on my earpiece with a message that she delivered in a voice so carefully steady that I knew she had practiced keeping it that way. "Graves, command reports that 11 Vethkara capital ships have lost fleet coordination signal. 7 are showing internal breach engagement indicators. The Armada formation is beginning to show positional drift." I stopped what I was doing for just a moment. Positional drift. In a Vethkara fleet formation. In 41 years of expansion, that had never happened. I looked at Bricks. He was watching me with those golden eyes, reading whatever he read in my face, and his tail moved once. Slow. Deliberate. "Tell command we'll have this hub dark in 4 minutes," I said. "Copy, Graves." I went back to work. Bricks took the shot on level 3. I felt it through the sync before I heard the sound of it, which is a strange thing to try to explain. The connection between a handler and a hound does not transmit pain directly. Dr. Ford's team had been very careful about that. very deliberate in the design, because a handler who felt their dog's pain with full intensity would be immediately non-functional, and that would help no one. What the sync transmitted instead was an alert, a sharp, clear signal in the emotional register that said, "He has been hurt. Something has happened." I was on the far side of the communications hub when it reached me, and I was moving before I had consciously decided to move. Brix had left the hub to clear the corridor outside when the engagement at our door resumed. He had gone without needing to be told because that was how we worked, each of us understanding our role and moving to fill it without the friction of communication. He had been in the corridor for less than 90 seconds. I found him 12 meters from the hub door. He was still on his feet. That was the first thing I checked, instinctively, because if he was still on his feet, the situation was recoverable. A Vethkara directed energy discharge had caught the back section of his vest, burning through the outer layer and into the reinforced shield underneath. The shield had done what it was designed to do, and what had reached him was reduced, but reduced was not zero, and there was damage to the right rear section of his body that I could see clearly, and that made something cold move through my chest. He looked at me when I reached him. "I know," I said. "I know. Hold still." He held still. He was panting, which was his body's response to the injury, and his eyes were tracking with perfect clarity, which was what I needed to see. The tracking told me his head was clear. I ran my hands over him with the rapid assessment protocol we had trained for, and what I found was painful and serious, but not the worst that I had feared. He would need the medical team. He needed it soon, but he was stable enough to continue holding position if I could manage the wound. I carried everything I needed in the left thigh pocket of my suit. I had repacked it personally before the mission, as I did before every mission, because the repacking was part of the ritual that told my hands what might be needed and made sure they would know what to reach for in the dark. I worked quickly. Brix did not move while I worked on him. He did not make a sound. He watched my face with the focused attention he gave to everything I did, that particular quality of trust that had broken my heart more than once over 6 years, because it was so complete and so freely given, and I was never entirely sure I deserved it. "You're all right," I told him, because he listened to my voice even when he could not understand the words, and the steadiness in a voice carries its own kind of information. "You're all right, Brix. I've got you." His tail moved. Once. Slowly. "Yeah," I said. "I know." I finished the field dressing and helped him to his feet. He was weight-bearing, which was another important check. Not perfectly comfortable, clearly, but bearing weight, and when I started moving back toward the hub he came with me, his gait slightly adjusted, but his attention fully forward. In my earpiece the battle was building toward something. The comms traffic had changed in character. The early reports had been tactical, specific, focused on individual breach operations and hub targets and corridor progress. Now the traffic had a different quality. Larger. The intelligence picture was expanding, and what it showed was something that none of the people I could hear in my earpiece had quite been prepared to process emotionally, even though we had all been preparing for it strategically for years. The Vethkara fleet was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble they could absorb and redirect and overcome through the superior firepower they absolutely still possessed. A different kind of trouble. The kind that comes not from losing a battle but from losing the assumption on which your entire strategic identity is built. The assumption, in their case, was simple. Resistance is not possible. 41 years, 14 species. They had been so right for so long that the assumption had stopped feeling like an assumption and had started feeling like a fact, a law of the universe, a thing as certain as the physics of their transit drives or the mechanics of their weapons systems. It was not a fact. It was a habit. And habits, when they encounter something genuinely new, break in interesting ways. A Vethkara capital ship of the class we were aboard had a crew of approximately 11,000. Those 11,000 individuals had trained for exterior combat operations. They had trained to crew their stations, to manage their weapons systems, to coordinate with the fleet. What they had not trained for, what no one in the Vethkara military had trained for in living memory, was the problem of an enemy already inside the hull, already in the corridors, already between them and the systems they needed to reach to fight back in the way they knew how to fight. And not just inside. moving faster than their internal tracking could follow, operating in a coordinated pattern that did not match any tactical template they had developed, using the architecture of their own ship against them, the curves and the connecting passages and the maintenance accesses that Petra had found, all of it now turned into a map that the hounds read better than the crew that lived there. 14 species had tried to fight the Vethkara and lost. None of them had sent dogs. Commander Lucy Carr's voice came through my earpiece while I was moving back toward the hub, Bricks steady at my left side. Graves, Carr here. We have the secondary navigation array on Deck 9. Kodak is holding the access corridor. I'm getting Vethkara crew consolidating on Deck 10. They're pulling back from the forward sections. What's your read? I asked. A brief pause. In the pause I heard Kodak in the background. A low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite something else. The particular vocalization he made when he was holding a position and knew the hold was working. They don't know what to do with us, Lucy said simply. They keep trying to engage in a way we're not engaging back. They're waiting for something they recognize. She was right about that. The Vethkara military doctrine was sophisticated, but it was also, in its own way, rigid. It had been built on the template of the engagements they had won, and those engagements had all followed a recognizable shape. There was a phase of overwhelming force projection. There was a phase of defensive collapse by the target species. There was a phase of consolidation. The species being conquered might do various things in the defensive collapse phase, but they always collapsed. The shape was always the same. We were not collapsing. We were not even defending. Not exactly. We were doing something the Vethkara did not have a word for, because they had never encountered it before. We were inside their ships, moving through their corridors, taking their systems apart from the inside, and we were doing it with something that did not behave like a weapon because it was not a weapon. It was a partnership. At 0534 hours, the comms officer on Platform 7 patched through a broad fleet communication that had been captured from the Vethkara command channel. Our translation software processed it in real time. The Vethkara fleet commander was asking, in a tone our translators flagged as registering high-intensity uncertainty, which was a designation none of our translation teams had ever attached to a Vethkara command communication before, for a damage assessment from all vessels. The responses came back fragmented and inconsistent, which was itself information. A Vethkara fleet that was functioning normally would have answered that query in under 4 seconds with complete and synchronized data. The responses were taking longer. Some were incomplete. 2 came back as static. The fleet was not functioning normally. I reached the hub and found Danny at the door, Petra beside him, both of them looking out into the corridor with the focused calm that came from 4 years of working together. Danny looked at Bricks when I came through, read the field dressing and the adjusted gait, and his face did something brief and carefully controlled. "How is he?" Danny asked. "He's working," I said. Danny nodded. He understood what that meant. Bricks heard his name in the exchange the way dogs always hear their names even when they are not spoken, some quality of attention in the air that registers without being consciously produced. And his ear moved toward Danny, and then back toward me. "Second wave is deploying," Danny said. 400 fresh teams. They're hitting the next tier of the fleet. I had known this was coming. It was the second phase of the operation, timed for when the first wave had created enough internal confusion to make the second wave's approach unpredictable. But hearing it confirmed, standing in the damaged communications hub of a Vethkara cruiser with Bricks at my side, and the battle spreading outward through the fleet like a fire that had found all the right conditions, something shifted in my understanding of the moment. This was actually working. Not in the careful theoretical way that plans work when you run them in a simulation room at a defense facility on a quiet afternoon. Actually working, in the way that things work when you have built them on something real. I put my hand on Bricks's back. He was warm, steady. His breathing had settled from the earlier pace. The field dressing was holding. "Second wave," I said quietly. "That means more of our people coming through, more of the hounds." Bricks turned his head and looked at me. "We're going to hold this position," I told him, "and then we're going to let the second wave push through, and then we're going to find you a medical bay." He held my gaze for a moment. There was something in the quality of his attention that I had learned, over 6 years, to recognize as the particular way he listened when he was deciding whether the situation matched what I was telling him. He was very good at reading me, better than most people. He seemed to conclude that my assessment was accurate. He lay down across the hub doorway, facing the corridor. He was not retreating. He was positioning. The difference was entirely clear to anyone who understood dogs, which meant it was entirely clear to every person in that hub, and it was entirely clear to me. He was holding the line. I sat down beside him, my back against the doorframe, and for a moment, in the middle of the largest battle humanity had ever fought, I listened to him breathe, and felt the warm weight of his side against my leg, and thought about Clara's letter in my breast pocket, about bees and morning light, and honey waiting for me in a jar on a kitchen shelf in Wales. The second wave was deploying. The fleet was fracturing, and Brix's tail was moving in slow, steady arcs across the floor of an alien warship, because he was a good dog, and he was exactly where he chose to be. The Vethkara fleet commander sent a second transmission at 0611 hours. This one was not on the universal frequency. It was on a command channel, encrypted with the highest tier protocol in their system, which our intelligence teams had been quietly working on for 9 years. The decryption took 11 minutes. What came back from the translation software was flagged, again, with that same notation our translators had never used before for a Vethkara source: high-intensity uncertainty. I read the translated text in my earpiece while helping Danny stabilize a jammed access panel on Deck 4, Brix resting behind us against the corridor wall, his breathing steady, the field dressing holding. The fleet commander was asking his captains to confirm whether the internal engagement on their vessels had been resolved. Of the 31 ships in the first wave of the Armada, 24 could not confirm resolution. 12 reported that their primary communications systems had gone dark. 7 reported that their navigation arrays were no longer responding to command inputs. 3 reported that their crew was consolidating on upper decks, and that large sections of their lower vessel were no longer under their operational control. 3 ships, in the Vethkara fleet, with sections outside their control. I read it twice to make sure the translation was what I thought it was. It was. I found I had no words for what I felt in that moment. It was not triumph exactly, because triumph is too simple a thing, and what was happening was not simple. It was something that lived alongside grief, alongside the weight of every loss that had brought us to this point, alongside the cost that was being counted in real time in my earpiece, as handler teams reported injuries, and the medical units across the network activated, and the second wave of hounds hit the second tier of the fleet, in a wave of breach pods that our sensors showed as thousands of small bright points of impact spreading across the alien hulls, like the beginning of something, or the end of something, or both. Lieutenant Commander Holt came through on my personal channel. Graves. Commander. How's your team? I thought about how to answer that honestly. We're functional. Brix took a hit on level 3. He's stable. Danny and Petra have the navigation array on Deck 9. Lucy Carr has the secondary comms on Deck 7. We have the primary hub dark. A pause. Good, she said. Very good. Command wants a read on the crew consolidation pattern. Where are they pulling back to? I had been tracking this through the combined picture our pod cluster was building together, each handler contributing their piece of the spatial map as they moved through different sections of the ship. Upper decks. Specifically toward what we think is their emergency command station. They're trying to re-establish coordination from a hardened position. They won't manage it, she said. Not in time. The second wave is through. We have teams on 6 more capital ships in the second tier. Their formation is... She paused, and in the pause I heard something in her voice that I had never heard there before. A quality she was controlling carefully but not quite completely. Their formation is breaking, Owen. She never used my first name in operational settings. I understood why she had used it now. I'll get our teams moving toward the upper decks, I said. Carefully, she said. You have an injured animal. He wouldn't agree that it changes anything. Another pause. No, she said. I don't suppose he would. Keep me updated. The channel closed. I looked at Brix. He had heard my voice change, or felt it through the sync, or both. He was on his feet before I had turned to face him fully, his weight slightly favoring the uninjured side, but his attention completely forward, the golden eyes sharp and ready. We're moving, I said. He was already moving. We pushed toward the upper decks through a ship that had changed in character around us. The corridors that had been actively contested in the first hour were quieter now. Not empty. The Vethkara crew was still there, but the nature of their presence had shifted. They were moving in patterns that told a trained observer a specific story. They were not advancing. They were not trying to clear us out. They were pulling inward, consolidating, which is what any military force does when it is no longer confident about the perimeter and is trying to protect the center. The center, in this case, was their emergency command station. Our center was everywhere. Danny's voice came through the cluster comm as we passed Deck 6. Petra's reading crew movement above us. 3 decks up, moving toward what I think is their armory annex. Let them go, I said. We don't need the annex. Keep the navigation array. Copy. A second later, Lucy Carr's voice. Graves, I'm getting something on the command channel. Our translators are working on it. How long? Maybe 4 minutes. It's shorter than the last one. A shorter transmission from the fleet commander. That was information in itself. The first transmission had been a request for damage assessment, which required length because it was asking for many things from many sources. A short transmission meant a decision had been made. It meant the assessment phase was over. Stay on it, I said. We reached Deck 8 and found 2 other handler pairs from a different pod cluster, a pair I did not know personally. The handler, a young man named Colin Webb who could not have been more than 20, was moving with a tall brindle hound I recognized as a veteran animal from the training facility on the moon base. The dog's name was Archer. He was 7 years old and had been in this program longer than Colin had. When he looked at Brix, there was a kind of acknowledgement between them, brief and wordless, the way experienced individuals in any field recognize each other. Webb, I said. Sir, he said. He looked at Brix's dressing. How bad? He's working, I said. Colin nodded, the same way Danny had nodded, understanding the complete answer in those 2 words. We found something on Deck 7 you should see, he said. He took us to a section of the ship I had not mapped yet, a wider corridor that opened into what the Vethkara apparently used as a kind of crew gathering space. I did not know their word for it. It was simply a larger room with surfaces that could be sat upon and lighting at a warmer end of their spectrum. It had the quality of a space used for rest. Seated along the walls of this space were approximately 60 Vethkara crew members who were not soldiers, technical staff, support personnel, individuals without weapons and without the posture of combatants. They were sitting with the careful stillness of people who had made a decision to remain exactly where they were and cause no trouble. Archer was in the center of the room. He was lying down. Not in a guarding position, not in an alert posture. He was lying on his side in the middle of the Vethkara rest space, in a posture that every dog handler in the human military would have recognized immediately as the position a dog adopts when it has decided that the immediate situation is under control and that it is acceptable to demonstrate this by being visibly at ease. 2 of the Vethkara crew members near him had extended their upper limbs toward him. Their hands, or what served that function, were resting near his back, not touching, near. He had not moved away from them. I stood in the doorway and looked at this for a moment. Colin Webb stood beside me. He's been like that for about 12 minutes, he said. Nobody in this room has done anything concerning. Nobody's tried to leave. I did not know what the Vethkara crew members near Archer were thinking. I did not know what impulse had led them to extend their limbs toward a large unknown animal in the middle of a combat situation. But I knew what Archer's posture meant. It meant he had assessed them and found them to be no threat, and had communicated this to them in the oldest and most universal language available, the language of a creature that chooses to be calm. I thought about Dr. Ford, who had been retired for 15 years but was still, I had been told, keeping up with the program from a small house near the coast of Ireland. I thought about what she might have said if she had been standing in this doorway. I thought she would not have been surprised. Lucy Carr's voice arrived in my earpiece. Translation is done. It's from the fleet commander. It's short. A pause. It's a retreat order. The corridor was very quiet around me. Say that again, I said. The fleet commander has ordered a general retreat. All vessels, 1st and 2nd tier. They're to disengage and pull back to Transit Point Delta. Bricks made a sound. It was not a bark, and not a growl. It was the low, soft sound he made sometimes when something had resolved, when a situation that had been tense had shifted into something that was no longer requiring his full alert attention. A sound that had no good human equivalent, that lived somewhere between a sigh and a hum. I put my hand on his back. He was warm and solid and alive. "Acknowledged," I said into the channel. "Tell command we're maintaining position until confirmed withdrawal." I looked at Archer in the center of the rest space, calm and unhurried, with Vethkara crew members sitting quietly around him. I looked at Colin Webb, who was 20 years old, and standing very straight and blinking more than usual. "Good work, Webb," I said. "Thank you, sir," he said. His voice was steady, his eyes were bright. Outside the ship, the fleet was turning. I was still in the Vethkara rest space on Deck 7 when the withdrawal was confirmed. It came through on the broad channel, 40 minutes after Lucy Carr had relayed the retreat order, formatted as a standard tactical update in the kind of language that military communications use to contain large things inside small containers. Vethkara fleet elements confirmed withdrawing to Transit Point Delta. First and second tier vessels are leaving engagement range. Third tier is holding position. No further hostile action from withdrawing elements. 40 minutes. The Vethkara had taken 41 years to build an empire. They had taken approximately 3 hours to decide that the species they had come to remove from the solar system was not removable in the way they had planned. The third tier was holding position, which meant they were not yet fully committed to the retreat, which meant our job was not finished. But the first and second tier were leaving, the ships we had breached, the ships where the hounds were still moving through corridors and holding navigation arrays and sitting calmly in rest spaces. Those ships were withdrawing. Because we were inside them and they could not get us out. I sat on the floor of the rest space with my back against the wall and Brix's head in my lap, and I thought about the numbers. I had heard them in fragments through my earpiece over the previous hours. Human casualties were lighter than any pre-mission projection had estimated, because the pre-mission projections had been built conservatively, with appropriate allowance for the gap between planning and execution. The gap had been smaller than expected. The hounds had performed beyond their already very high projected parameters, because what is difficult to put into a projection model is the specific quality of effectiveness that comes from an animal operating inside a relationship built on years of trust. Brix casualties across the core were also lower than projected. This was the number I cared about most. I am not embarrassed to say that. A handler who says otherwise is either lying or has not been in the program long enough. The Vethkara losses were significant, not primarily in the way most people think of military losses. Their ships were largely intact. We had not destroyed their fleet. We had not needed to. What we had taken from them was something less visible and more important. We had taken the assumption that no resistance was possible. The assumption was gone now. You cannot unknow a thing once you have encountered its contradiction. The Vethkara had constructed their entire strategic identity on the certainty that species on the wrong side of a technology and numbers gap could not meaningfully fight back. They had been right about that for long enough that it had become foundational to how they understood the universe. They were going to need time to rebuild their understanding. We planned to use that time productively. At 0814 hours, a transmission arrived on the universal frequency. Not encrypted, not coded. Open, so our translators had it immediately, and I received it in my earpiece not as data but as words. The Vethkara fleet commander spoke in the same flat, bored tone he had used in his first transmission, or what the translation software rendered as that tone. But the intelligence team later analyzed the original audio and noted that there were qualities in the original signal that the flat translation did not capture, things that were difficult to render in human language but that corresponded, as closely as the analysts could determine, to something like bewilderment. He said, "What are those creatures to you?" He was asking about the dogs. He had watched, through whatever sensor systems remained functional on his flagship, as the breach operation unfolded. He had seen the pattern of it, the paired movements of handler and hound, the way the dogs moved through his ships, and the way the humans followed. He had access to the internal sensor logs of the vessels we had breached. He had seen Archer lying in the rest space. He had seen Brix guarding the corridor outside the communications hub. He had seen the 100 small moments in which a dog and a person operated as something that was more than either of them separately. He had no framework for it. He was asking because he genuinely did not know. The question went up through command channels quickly, because it was the kind of question that required a decision about who answered and how. It reached Lieutenant Commander Holt. She contacted me. I suspect she contacted me because I was the senior handler whose communications had been most present in the battle record, or possibly because she knew me well enough to know I would not over-answer. She said, "The fleet commander is asking what the dogs are to us. Would you like to respond?" I looked at Brix. He was sleeping. The medical team had reached us 40 minutes ago and had upgraded my field dressing with something more thorough, and they had given him something for the pain, and now he was sleeping with his head in my lap the way he had slept across my boots 1,000 times before, in the bunk room on Platform 7, in transport carriers, in the waiting areas of training facilities on 3 different installations. He breathed slowly. His ear twitched once. I thought about the question. I thought about Dr. Ford, asking her committee what asymmetric advantage humanity had. I thought about the 10,000 years before that, the fire and the cold and the wolves at the edge of the light. I thought about Clara's letter in my breast pocket, about honey and bees, and the particular quality of a morning when nothing is required of you except to notice how the light looks. I thought about Danny Firth at 22, blinking his bright eyes, and Lucy Carr's completely calm voice in the middle of combat, and Colin Webb standing very straight with his 20-year-old shoulders squared, and Archer lying on his side in a room full of aliens, while 2 of them reached toward him, because whatever impulse makes a living thing want to touch something gentle is apparently not entirely limited to human beings. I thought about what it had taken, the 60 years of patience, the decisions made by people who would not live to see the moment they were preparing for, the understanding that some things cannot be rushed, that a bond is not a device and cannot be manufactured on a timeline, that if you want something to be unbreakable you have to build it out of the right materials and give it the right time, and trust the process in the way that is hardest to sustain, which is the way that requires no immediate proof that it is working. I pressed the transmit key. "They are our family," I said, "and humans do not leave family behind." I released the key. Brix exhaled in his sleep, a long and easy breath. The fleet commander did not respond. I did not expect him to. The answer was not the kind that invites a follow-up. It is the kind that sits in the air and requires the listener to do something with it privately, in whatever space their mind keeps for things it needs to process at length. Outside the ship, the first and second tier of the Vethkara fleet were moving away from us. The sensor data came through in intervals, each update showing more distance between them and our positions. The tight formation that had looked so absolute and final when it appeared on our screens at 0312 hours, now stretched and gapped and retreating, in a way that our sensor operators were apparently having some difficulty describing in standard tactical language, because the standard tactical language had been built on the assumption that a Vethkara fleet in engagement range did not do this. The third tier was still holding. They would not hold long. We had teams moving. The second wave was through and consolidating, and beginning to apply the same pressure to the third-tier vessels that the first wave had applied to the first. They had fresh hounds and fresh handlers, and the enormous advantage of operating against an enemy that was now uncertain in a way it had never been uncertain before, that was trying to apply a playbook to a situation the playbook had not been written for. Uncertainty, in a military force that has been built on absolute confidence, is more destabilizing than any external damage we could have done to their ships. Patricia Holt came through on my channel one more time, around 0900 hours, while I was helping Danny and Petra check the junction points of the navigation array they had been holding for the better part of 3 hours. "Graves," she said. "Commander. Third tier is pulling back. All elements." I stopped what I was doing. "All elements," I repeated. "All elements. Transit drives are spinning up across the board. They're going." The corridor was quiet around me. Danny had stopped working too. He was looking at me. Petra was looking at me. Even Brix, who had been moving slowly alongside me since waking from his medicated rest, had his golden eyes up and his ears forward in the posture he used when my voice told him something had changed. I thought about 14 civilizations. I thought about 12 that were gone and 2 that had been dissolved. I thought about the particular grief of being the last ones who remembered something, which was the position those surviving two species now occupied, carrying the shape of a world that no longer existed, in a language they were no longer allowed to speak freely. I thought about Clara's bees. "Commander," I said, "what's our status on casualties?" She gave me the numbers. I will not repeat them here in full, because they belong to the people who carry them, and not to a general account. What I will say is that the number was smaller than it had any right to be given the scale of what we had just done, and that every individual in that number was someone's family, and that the smallness of the number did not make any particular entry in it easier to hold. "Thank you," I said. "Good work today, Owen," she said. There was that first name again. "Go find your medical team. Get Bricks looked at properly." "Yes, ma'am." The channel closed. I looked down at Bricks. He looked up at me. There is a thing that happens sometimes, between a handler and a hound who have been together long enough and through enough, where the communication requires no mechanism at all. No sync, no gesture, no word. It is simply two beings who know each other at the level where knowledge stops being something you remember and starts being something your body knows without thinking. He knew we were done for today. I knew he knew. I crouched down and put both my arms around him carefully, mindful of the medical dressing, and he leaned into it the way he always leaned into contact, without reservation, without conditions, with the complete and uncomplicated generosity that is one of the defining qualities of a good dog, and the quality that I have never been able to think about for very long, without feeling something shift in the back of my throat. "I've got you," I said. "We're going. You did well. You were so good." His tail moved against the floor. Slow arcs, back and forth. Outside the ship, the stars were reappearing from behind the withdrawing fleet, one by one, as the dark mass of the Vethkara vessels pulled away, and the familiar constellations came back into the view from Platform 7's observation windows. Somewhere in that direction, past the retreating Armada and the transit points and the vast distances between here and where they had come from, the Vethkara fleet commander was sitting with my answer. They are our family, and humans do not leave family behind. I do not know what he made of it. I do not know if his species has a word for family that means what our word means, or if the translator had given him something that approximated the meaning without quite landing in it. I do not know if 41 years of conquest had left him any framework for understanding a relationship built not on utility, or on hierarchy, or on the functional exchange of services, but on the simple and very old decision to choose each other. I hope it gave him something to think about for a long time. I hope it changed something. What I know is what I have always known. What 6 years with Bricks, and 11 months on Platform 7, and a childhood that included a yellow dog named Arthur, who slept at the foot of my bed and followed me to school every morning, until the school asked my parents to please stop him, and my parents half-heartedly tried, of all contributed to. That the species which decides another creature is worth protecting, worth partnering with, worth loving over centuries until the love becomes structural. That species has access to something that cannot be manufactured or reverse-engineered or outspent. It cannot be outspent because it is not bought. It is given. Every day, in every bunk room and training facility, an orbital platform, and quiet monitoring station, in every moment of a handler sitting with a dog, through a night that is too long, or a silence that is too heavy, or a fear that is easier to carry, when there is a warm weight leaning against your leg, it is given again, and given again, without asking anything back except the same. We had spent 10,000 years building something the Vethkara had never thought to build, because they had never seen the need for it, and the need had never been urgent before. They built fleets. We built a bond. And the bond had turned out to be a better weapon than anything they had aimed at us. Not because it was designed to be a weapon, but because it was designed to be something else entirely. Something that makes you willing to do things for each other that a calculation of self-interest would never recommend. The medical team met us at the end of the corridor, a pair of veterinary officers in their marked suits with the compact field equipment they had been carrying through the ship behind the handler teams. The senior one, a woman named Dr. Alice Park, looked at Bricks with the particular professional assessment of someone who cares about what she is assessing and let the professional manner carry most of the weight of it. On the floor, she said to him, gently. He looked at me. Go on, I said. He lay down. She worked on him with quick, careful hands, and I stood beside him and kept one hand on his shoulder the whole time. And after a while, she looked up at me and said, he's going to be completely fine, full recovery, 6 weeks with restricted exercise. I felt something go out of me that I had been holding since the moment the sync had sent me the alert on level 3. It left in a rush, and left the space it had occupied feeling strange and a little hollow, and I realized my eyes were doing something I had not given them permission to do. Nobody in the corridor said anything about it. Danny, who was standing nearby, looked at the wall for a moment in the way that people look at walls when they are being tactful. Petra put her head against his knee and held it there. He put his hand on her head. The stars outside Platform 7's windows were clear again. The formation that had filled our sensors was gone, pushing back toward the transit points at the edge of our system, carrying with it a question I hoped would keep working its way through whatever passed for their high command for years to come. On a kitchen shelf in a small house in Wales, there was a jar of honey. I was going to get home to it. Brix's tail found its rhythm again, moving in slow, steady arcs across the corridor floor. It was the best thing I had ever seen.